Okay, doing a presentation on the O.J. Simpson case, famous or infamous case of Orenthal Jane Simpson for my class CJ 560 in a criminal justice class about courts and proceedings. So let's look at this case of the facts of the O.J. Simpson case and review these again, although it's doubtless familiar information to most people. So here is the O.J. Simpson case. So the background of the case, the full name of the case, the people of the state of California versus Orenthal James Simpson, 1995. Now this was called during the time and afterward, and I think rightly so, the trial of the century. And lots of books have been written, lots of detailed analysis, thought pieces have come out on this, and obviously it's a divisive issue. It was at the time. There have been depictions of this in popular media and fiction, such as the Netflix series. A useful page for some of the pre-search on this was the Wikipedia page just on the O.J. Simpson case itself, which is extensive. It has, because there's so much, and this trial took place over such a long period of time. So the verdict revealed also not only the verdict itself, which I'll talk about, but the verdict revealed a significant racial divide on views of the American criminal justice system in general. Now, there was a fairly significant racial divide during the time over the trial. Once the verdict came out, there was fear of that the verdict going either way could produce unrest in different segments of the population, depending on what was revealed. And it was also called the most publicized criminal trial in history by USA Today. This was something that people were engaged with, watching, interested in, not only because of the nature of the case, but because O.J. Simpson was a well-known celebrity and still is a well-known celebrity to this day. I have students who are in 12th grade who were born in 2001, 2002, and they know very well who O.J. Simpson is. About 150 million Americans watched the verdict on television. This entailed lost productivity. They even said at work places, lower water usage as people didn't go to the bathroom so that they didn't miss anything. And so this was something that was watched. It was almost popularized television, even though it was real, and it bore the hallmarks of all the things that you would want to see in a crime drama type movie. And that was kind of one of the things that was even criticized of the judge, Lance Ito, is his allowance of this trial to be filmed, and whether or not that influenced from the outside. There is a reference in my bibliography on this that looks into this kind of interesting study of people's perception of themselves and others with regard to what Americans should be allowed to see and watch. And people tend, not surprisingly, to view themselves as impartial and uninfluenced by media, though they do not extend that trust to others. They do not expect others to have the same, in their mind, mental faculties to be able to separate the fact from the fancy, as it were. And so this case is interesting and significant. Let's look into some other factors of it. So here's some of the background and the facts. The charges were the murder of Nicole Brown Simpson, O.J. Simpson's ex-wife, and Ron Goldman, friend of Nicole, who had come to return allegedly return something to her the evening of the murder. O.J. Simpson was immediately recognized as the primary suspect and was arrested a few days later after a famous car chase on several freeways, including the famous 405 freeway in LA, being driven by his friend and having a weapon in the car, and eventually returning to his home and finally being arrested. The date of the crime itself, the facts of the crime, took place on June 12th, almost June 13th, the late night on June 12th, 1994. The mode of the murder was a slashing death or a stabbing death, almost a beheading of the two victims. Now, what ended up happening, somewhat unsurprisingly, but perhaps unfortunately, was that the focus shifted almost exclusively to Nicole Brown Simpson. For several reasons. She was the ex-wife of OJ, and all these factors, and many not forgot, but Ron Goldman was not brought as prominently into the forefront. So that was the background of the facts and a little bit of analysis on that. The timeline. So the crime took place, as mentioned, on June 12th, 1994. The arraignment of Simpson, where he issued a plea of not guilty, famously saying, and the transcript of this can be found on CNN, they have the day-to-day, absolutely 100% not guilty, June 22nd, 1994. The jury was selected over a period of time from October to November 3rd of 1994. Now, it took a while to select the jury. Tons of people were actually volunteering for this jury duty in order to be a part of the OJ case. And so this invited all kinds of people who were involved in some way. And there was also a process of selection where they narrowed down, who had been involved with OJ, not involved, someone who had a conflicting interest that would have kept them from serving on a jury in this case. And so they narrowed it down, and then different jurors were dismissed at different times until they finally got down to the 12. The jury deliberation took place on October 2nd, 1995. So there's a tract of time that takes place basically from January, where the trial actually begins, to the final time that the jury sits down and discusses the case itself and then returns with their verdict. The case length, as I mentioned, January 24th, 1995, was the beginning, the official start date, though the crime had taken place almost 6+ months before, continuing until October 3rd, 1995, the day after the jury deliberated. The verdict was Simpson was acquitted on October 3rd, 1995. Now, the case length itself went through several iterations. Simpson hired what is known as the Dream Team, some of them pictured here: Robert Kardashian, Johnny Cochran, several other, Alan Dershowitz, several other famous and highly paid lawyers who were doubtless effective in bringing up several issues that of competing narratives to the story. The prosecutors were Marcia Clark and Chris Darden. On the other side, the prosecuting attorneys, they also were going through a process of trying to work through the narrative of the case, trying to show with DNA evidence and other factors beyond a reasonable doubt that Simpson was there, did commit these crimes. And anyway, so they continue this through. There were some famous moments. The court, of course, most famous being Johnny Cochran's line of if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. Speaking of the glove that was found on the property that was found to be worn likely during the murder, and Simpson famously trying on the glove, and other such moments as that. Also, one of the issues coming out that further heightened the racial tensions here were the fact that some racist statements in video or audio evidence from one of the detectives, Mark Furman, were revealed. And so this allowed for a continued narrative that this was a setup of OJ as a black man. Furman was the one who found the glove, found the evidence, and gathered a lot of this. And a lot of the other factors of this, as will come out in subsequent presentations on this, is that the way that the evidence was handled, where it was taken at different points, becomes a key factor in this as well. After the not guilty verdict on October 3rd, 1995, there is a civil trial that began in October 1996, not for the criminal charges, but dealt with the liability for wrongful death of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ron Goldman. That concluded 4 months later, requiring Simpson to pay $33.5 million for the wrongful deaths of those two victims. And the civil trial did not allow any cameras or anything to be a part of that, though it was followed closely by the media as well. Okay. The verdict, as mentioned, not guilty in violation of Penal Code 187A, a felony upon Nicole Brown Simpson, a human being, and not guilty of penalty, same, etc., a felony upon Ron Lyle Goldman, a human being, in the California versus Simpson 1995 case. Now, I hold that Simpson was guilty. I do believe that he committed these murders. I do admit, however, that the handling of some of the evidence and the procedural fallacies that took place were unwise. And actually, this is a discussion I have year to year with students in 12th grade. I give them jury cases that have already taken place, one of them being the O.J. Simpson case, and they get to look at the evidence and act as the jury themselves, and their verdicts, being what they may. It's a process of practicing thought, looking at evidence, thinking critically. But one of these groups over the years said something that I thought was fairly instructive. I'm not usually impressed when students jump in and say guilty, not guilty, or they pretend they have special knowledge, guilty, or they come in with their minds already made up, or they make their decision after 2 minutes of talking about it. And there are several reasons for that. But one group, and we talk about the verdicts, and I don't render value judgment on those verdicts, but we discuss them and talk through them and challenge them a little bit, be what they may. One of the groups discussed their reasoning for voting not guilty because they repeated the verdict. But they said that they believed, now this was interesting, they believed that Simpson was guilty of the murder, but the ways that the evidence was handled allowed for the possibility of reasonable doubt. And I thought that was some pretty good critical thinking. And I admit, again, that the way some of the evidence was handled procedurally could call into question some of those things. However, I think that the DNA evidence, I've got my notes here, DNA evidence provided, though DNA is imperfect and not always definitive, did demonstrate that the story that made the most sense was the simplest one, that Simpson did murder his ex-wife and Ron Goldman. Now, I think a lot of the issues got clouded because of the Mark Furman issue. which it is admitted. Mark Furman, had said these terrible things. That being said, the story of the narrative, I'll say, of how he would have had to, what he would have had to go through to get Simpson's blood, to get the glove, to plant this evidence in the way that it was done and the time period it was done, I don't think is possible. I think that's very doubtful, even if Furman is a bad guy. And so that is what I believe to be the case. Although I'm willing to look at it and continue looking at it and think through it carefully, because I did read an article or journal that's attached in my notes from Thompson, 1996, that talked about the problems of the DNA evidence, and which I'm willing to explore a little bit and examine once again. Returned here for one note. I'd like to read a section from Thomas Sowell, economist and philosopher, on this, and it speaks to the overall justice system's quest for cosmic justice, which is in the footnotes and or in the references page. And this is page 1920. And now he has kind of an interesting perspective on the case overall and what it speaks to as far as the American justice system in being able to accomplish justice for those who have had a crime committed against them, like Goldman, like Brown Simpson. Listen to this from pages 1920, although it's a more philosophical take. It says, a more recent cause célèbre of the American criminal justice system was the murder trial of former football star O.J. Simpson, which provoked widespread consternation, not only because it's not guilty verdict in the face of massive evidence to the contrary, but also because of the sheer length of time that the trial took. So a long time in this trial. It was more than a year after the murder itself before the trial concluded, even though Simpson was arrested within days after the body of his former wife was discovered. Those who take on this daunting task of defending the current criminal justice system were quick to claim that the defendant's wealth, celebrity, and race made the trial so long, as well as the verdict so unexpected, thereby making the case too atypical to be a part of the general indictment of the American criminal justice system. However, an even longer time elapsed in another contemporary murder case in which none of these factors was present, even though the suspect was likewise arrested not long after the crime. Nearly 3 years elapsed between the murder of 12-year-old Polly Klaas in 1993 and the sentencing of her murderer, Richard Allen Davis, in 1996, even though there was such evidence against the killer that there was not even a claim made of his defense attorney that Davis had not committed the crime. What could have taken so long then? Among other things, there were extended arguments over all sorts of legal technicalities created not by legislation, but by the judicial interpretations of appellate courts, seeking to remove more remote dangers of injustice by creating greater injustice of crippling society's ability to defend itself, even in the clearest cases of unquestioned guilt. Now, I've said before, after studying the Salem witch trial, better that 100 guilty go free than one innocent person be punished. And there is some truth to that principle. That being said, that only works in a system of, I believe now, legal perfectionism. And what is caused by this, according to Sowell and others, as I'm starting to learn as well, is that this humanistic idea of the perfection of humankind and the perfection of the legal system through perfect procedure is that it cripples justice in that it allows for injustice to go unpunished, unidentified, and those who really do seek justice in court end up pleading. They do a plea bargain because the courts are so overloaded. Now, this takes so long that it ends up crippling the justice system and not allowing it to bring justice, causing this kind of rejection of the law and lack of justice against the innocent. So it kind of has that double consequence to it. But it was interesting to note that O.J. Simpson's the case length was not just because he was a celebrity, because the case length goes on in many cases like that, because of the procedural rules to combat the idea of wanting to be careful, of combating the idea of an injustice that may take place because of a fallacy or an error in the human procedure, which is true. But on the other side, it allows no mechanism to truly move forward in punishing guilt. So anyway, that's Sobel's take on that. So not guilty verdict. Simpson was acquitted, of course. And the type of court, it was the Los Angeles County Superior Court. So county and state court is the people of the state of California versus O.J. Simpson, and then a civil suit in California court, in which O.J. was not charged with criminal charges, but with personal liability. Similarities. In civil court, there is a weighing of evidence, and in criminal court, there is a weighing of evidence. You can hear from witnesses, you can look at evidence, you can point out these different factors, but your end goal is different. Similar participants, there's a judge, prosecution, and defense. But look at the differences. The civil case is one much shorter than criminal cases, and this can be true. It depends, but in this case, it is true. Different burden of proof. The burden of proof is lower. It's not innocent until proven guilty in the sense of like a criminal trial. It's that there is there reasonable thinking that can lead to the assumption that this person bears some responsibility and ought to pay damages. And so since it's not a guilty verdict with criminal punishment at the end of it, the standard of proof and evidence is much lower. Lower standard to demonstrate liability rather than the guilt of a crime. One of the other differences is Simpson lost the civil case and won, if you will, the criminal case. So those are the main differences. Plus, I would add, even though it's not here in my slide, I just thought of that the televised nature of the criminal case versus the not televised nature of the civil case made a large difference as well. And then here are my references, some spoken to more than others, but kind of laying out the basis of the background of this case.